The book is If It Bleeds. It's published by Headline Review, and I'm the author, Duncan Campbell. It's about a murder of a gangland figure, a well-known kind of craze-type figure who's been around for more than 80 years. And it's investigated both by the police and by a crime reporter who's having his own problems. The key character is Laurie Lane. He's a reporter, he's in his 50s, he's having a bit of problem at work because he's been accused of fiddling his expenses. And his news editor would quite like to get rid of him and get in somebody who's a little cheaper and a little more savvy about cybercrime and internet crime and those kind of crimes rather than the old-fashioned bang-bang, gangland, armed robbery type of crimes that he knows most about. And he gets a phone call one day from this gang leader, who's now in his 80s, Old Man Hook his name is, who wants a journalist to ghost his autobiography. He's noticed a lot of true crime books around in the shops and sees them doing rather well, books by Frankie Fraser, books about the craze and so on, so he thinks he'd like a bit of that, but he needs a ghost to do it. So he calls up Laurie Lane, who's a little nervous about meeting him because he's got a reputation. He's slipped out of a couple of murder trials without being convicted, and he's got a reputation for violence. But he agrees to meet him, and but shortly after he meets, there's no more Mr. Hook, and that's when the story starts. I've been a crime reporter for many years. I was the crime correspondent at The Guardian for about 10 years, and I used to be the chairman of the Crime Reporters Association, which I'm sure no one has ever heard of. And I've written a number of histories of crime. I wrote a history called The Underworld and one called That Was Business, This Is Personal. And so I'm drawing from a lot of that experience in writing this book. The title, If It Bleeds, comes from an old slogan, if it bleeds, it leads, which is, I think, started in America. It was the headline, if there was a murder, that led the news. And if it bleeds, it leads. And as some people say, if it bleeds south of Leeds, it leads in the London papers. A lot of violence goes on maybe in Scotland and the north of England that doesn't get reported. But if there's a gangland killing in London or a very horrible murder, then it does lead the news. Things have changed quite a lot over the years. In the 60s and 70s, there were many family gangs. In a way, what's happened in crime is what's happened in business. You get your family firms have been taken over by multinationals. I met both of the Crays when they were alive, although they were by then either in prison or in Broadmoor. And I've met quite a lot of the other people involved in different London gangs. And what was different about them, I suppose, was they quite liked being known. They quite liked being known as faces and having a reputation so that when they came into a bar or a club, people looked around and recognized them. And they had the wedding photos of Reggie Cray were taken by David Bailey. They took themselves quite seriously, and that carried on right up, I suppose, until the 90s. And then people thought maybe it's not such a good idea to have a public profile because the Crays were untouchable for many years, and then the police decided to get them, and they went down very heavily for 30-year sentences. And so now you've got a much more multinational kind of crime, and that's in the book. The Russians have arrived. There are stereotypes of the Russians, just as there are stereotypes of all foreign criminals who come into Britain. But there's always been a wave of people coming from other countries here. They've always been the minority. The main criminals in this country are British-born criminals. But there's been a wave of people who come in, and because the police don't know anything about them, they usually can't speak their language, they have a period of 10 or 15 years when they can get away with literally murder. And so I'm trying to reflect that in the book as well, which is set in the present day. I'm working now on what I hope is the kind of large crime novel which will go back to the beginning of the last century and take one particular character through over all the extraordinary things that have happened in terms of crime in this country in that time, because I think that crime is a wonderful reflection of what's going on in society, either in terms of their attitudes to sex or drugs or money or property or whatever. And all aspects of life, I think, are reflected in what happens in the courts. I always encourage people to go spend a day at the Old Bailey, spend a day in the Magistrates' Court, and they'll learn more about life than they will from reading the newspapers in many ways. And that's why I find crime such a fascinating subject, because all human life is there.